On a cold December morning in 2009, police entered a quiet home in West Valley City, Utah. Inside, they found signs of a normal family morning. Breakfast dishes still on the table, coats hanging by the door, 2 children's toys scattered on the carpet. But there was something missing. Susan Powell, wife, mother, daughter, was gone. Her purse, keys, and phone were all still inside the house. The front door was locked, and her 2 little boys, ages 4 and 2, were nowhere to be found. Within hours, her husband, Josh Powell, returned home from what he called a spontaneous camping trip with their sons. The temperature that night had been below freezing. When officers asked where Susan was, Josh said, almost casually, that he had no idea. That moment would mark the beginning of one of the most haunting family mysteries in American true crime history, a disappearance that would spiral into obsession, tragedy, and murder. Because what started as a missing person case would end in an explosion of horror that no one saw coming. Susan Cox Powell grew up in Puyallup, Washington, a small town where she was known for her kindness and determination. Friends remembered her as ambitious but grounded, a woman who believed in faith, family, and hard work. In 2000, while attending church, she met Joshua Powell, a tall, confident man who seemed charming at first. Josh came from a complicated family background. His father, Susan Powell, was eccentric, controlling, and often crossed boundaries even with his own children. Susan and Josh married in April 2001. In the beginning, they were the picture of a happy young couple. Susan worked as a cosmetologist while Josh studied business and IT. They bought their first home, attended church together, and seemed to live the perfect suburban dream. But underneath that image, cracks began to form early. Josh was controlling with money and often spent beyond their means. He made Susan record every expense in detail, down to the price of milk. As time passed, Josh's controlling nature grew worse. He often belittled Susan, demanded obedience, and isolated her from friends. Susan confided to those close to her that her marriage didn't feel like love. It felt like survival. By 2005, they had their first son, Charlie, followed by Braden in 2007. Becoming a mother gave Susan purpose, but it also trapped her further inside a marriage that was deteriorating fast. Josh struggled to hold a stable job, and his spending habits kept the family in constant financial stress. Susan, desperate to protect her children, began keeping a private journal. In one chilling entry she wrote, "If I die, it may not be an accident. I fear Josh." By 2008, she began recording home videos, not for memories, but for evidence. In one clip later released by police, Susan documented their home's state, mentioning how she wanted her belongings recorded, just in case. Despite her growing fear, Susan stayed. She believed things could improve, that Josh would change, but those who knew her could see she was slowly fading, her laughter rarer, her energy drained. Tension between Josh and Susan wasn't just about control. It was also about Susan Powell, Josh's father. Stephen had developed an unhealthy obsession with Susan. He wrote songs about her, stole personal items from her, and even secretly recorded her with a hidden camera. Susan confided that Stephen's behavior made her deeply uncomfortable. She confronted Josh about it, but instead of protecting her, he dismissed it, calling his father's actions just weird but harmless. That moment, many believe, was the final sign that Susan was alone in her marriage. By the end of 2009, friends and co-workers noticed that she had grown more distant. She stopped smiling as much, often mentioning how exhausted she felt. Her final journal entry, written just days before she vanished, was simple yet haunting. "I want to be strong. I want to live. But I'm scared." On December 6, 2009, Susan attended church with her family. She was last seen that afternoon at home, cooking pancakes for lunch. A neighbor later recalled hearing laughter followed by silence. By the next morning, she was gone. The morning of December 7th, 2009, was unusually quiet on the suburban street of West Valley City. Snow blanketed the driveways, and the chill made the air feel heavier than usual. At the Powell residence, neighbors noticed something odd. The house was empty, and the family's minivan was missing. By noon, co-workers started to worry. Susan hadn't shown up for work, and she wasn't answering her phone. Her friends described her as dependable, the kind of person who never missed a shift or failed to call in sick. Something was wrong. That afternoon, the daycare center called the police. Neither Charlie nor Braden had been dropped off, and no one could reach Josh or Susan. Within hours, police officers arrived at the Powell home to perform a welfare check. The house was locked from the inside. When officers entered through a window, they found no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, nothing broken. But the scene felt off. A fan was running, blowing air toward a damp spot on the carpet. Susan's purse, keys, wallet, and phone were still there. Her car sat in the driveway. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Later that evening, Josh Powell finally returned home with his two sons. When officers asked where he'd been, his answer raised eyebrows immediately. He said he'd taken the boys on a late-night camping trip, leaving home around midnight, to the Simpson Springs Desert, about 25 miles away. Police were stunned. It had been below 0 degrees that night. What kind of father takes his toddlers camping in the freezing Utah desert after midnight on a Sunday? Josh insisted it was just a spur-of-the-moment trip. He said Susan was home when they left, asleep on the couch. When they returned, she was gone. Detectives found his tone strangely casual, his story rehearsed yet hollow. There was no genuine worry in his voice. Instead, he seemed more concerned about how long officers were searching his house. When investigators pressed further, Josh's timeline kept shifting. He couldn't recall when they left or which roads he'd taken. His phone had been turned off during the trip. Meanwhile, Susan's friends and family were in shock. Her father, Chuck Cox, immediately reported her missing and told investigators about the growing tension in her marriage. He didn't hesitate. He believed Josh was involved. That night, search teams were deployed across West Valley and the surrounding desert areas. But the freezing weather made it nearly impossible to search thoroughly. Over the next few days, the story began to unravel publicly. The media picked it up, and within a week, the disappearance of Susan Powell became a national headline. Police executed a search warrant on the Powell home and uncovered something chilling: traces of Susan's blood on the couch and floor near where the fan had been running. They also found evidence that Josh had recently cleaned parts of the home. In Susan's locked safe deposit box, investigators discovered a handwritten will. In it, she expressed fear for her life and stated clearly that, "If anything happens to me, it may not be an accident. It may be my husband." The evidence painted a dark picture. Still, without a body, there was no case for arrest. Josh was questioned multiple times but never charged. His story remained the same. Susan was home when he left, and he had no idea where she was. Behind the scenes, police tried to track his movements. They found that he had rented a car days after Susan disappeared and drove over 800 miles in 24 hours, but refused to explain where he went. When questioned, he simply said he was clearing his head. The investigation slowed, but the family's hope didn't. Chuck Cox, Susan's father, organized searches, held vigils, and spoke to the media almost daily. He begged Josh to cooperate, but Josh withdrew completely. He moved his sons out of state, away from Susan's family, away from scrutiny, to live near his father, Stephen Powell, in Washington. That move would reveal something far darker than anyone imagined. Because while investigators were still looking for Susan, They were about to uncover disturbing secrets inside the Powell family itself, secrets that would turn a missing person mystery into a full-blown psychological nightmare. After Susan's disappearance, Josh Powell's behavior grew increasingly strange. He didn't act like a grieving husband. Instead of helping the police, he began to distance himself, refusing media interviews, ignoring calls from investigators, and avoiding Susan's side of the family altogether. Within weeks, he packed up his 2 sons and drove nearly 800 miles north to Puyallup, Washington, to live with his father, Susan Powell. For the Cox family, Susan's parents, this move felt like a betrayal. Not only had Josh taken their grandsons away, but he had moved in with a man whose behavior toward Susan had long been deeply unsettling. Investigators followed Josh to Washington, continuing to press for answers. But instead of new clues about Susan, they stumbled upon something else, a disturbing window into the Powell family's private world. Susan Powell, Josh's father, had always been described as eccentric. But as police began to look closer, they realized he wasn't just eccentric, he was dangerous. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Susan's home in 2011, nearly 2 years after Susan vanished. What they found was horrifying. Susan had kept hundreds of photos and videos of Susan, taken without her knowledge. Hidden in his computer were images of Susan doing ordinary things, gardening, walking, playing with her children, all secretly recorded from behind blinds or through half-closed doors. He had even stolen personal items from her home, including underwear, and labeled CDs with her name. Investigators found journals where Susan wrote about his obsession with Susan, describing his fantasies and his belief that she was secretly in love with him. The level of fixation was so intense, it made police question whether he too could have been involved in her disappearance. When they confronted him, Susan admitted to being infatuated, but denied having any role in what happened to her. Still, his arrest was inevitable. He was charged with voyeurism and child pornography after investigators uncovered additional illicit material. The discovery shocked the nation. Overnight, the Powell family's image shifted from troubled to toxic. It painted a disturbing portrait, not just of one man, but of an entire household steeped in secrecy and manipulation. Meanwhile, Josh continued to spiral. He fought bitterly with Susan's parents over custody of the children. During interviews with social workers, young Charlie, Susan's eldest, said something chilling. He told them that Mommy went on a trip and didn't come back, and that she was in the trunk. When questioned further, he drew pictures of his family camping. But in every drawing, his mother was missing. Investigators feared the child had witnessed something the night Susan disappeared, something too traumatic for him to fully understand. Police attempted to bring new charges against Josh based on circumstantial evidence, but prosecutors said it still wasn't enough. No body, no physical proof, only suspicion. In 2011, a major search operation was launched in the Utah desert near Simpson Springs, the same place Josh claimed he'd taken his boys camping. Search teams dug through abandoned mines, using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. But again, no trace of Susan was ever found. While investigators dug for clues, Josh began building a new life, one that looked normal on the outside but was unraveling from within. He rented a modest home in Graham, Washington, and continued supervised visits with his sons. Social workers noted how tense those visits were. The boys seemed happy to see their father, but often appeared frightened when the visits ended. By this time, Josh had become the primary suspect in Susan's disappearance. He was under constant scrutiny. His finances were failing, his reputation destroyed, and his father, the only family member who defended him, was now in jail. Behind closed doors, Josh's anger festered. He believed everyone, the media, the police, Susan's parents, had turned against him. By early 2012, the custody battle reached its peak. The court ruled that the boys would stay with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, while Josh underwent a full psychosexual evaluation. It was a devastating blow. For the first time, Josh realized he might lose everything, not just his freedom, but his children too. And then, something inside him snapped. On the surface, February 5, 2012, began like any other day. A social worker brought Charlie and Braden for a routine supervised visit at Josh's home. When she arrived, Josh smiled, greeted his sons warmly, and ushered them inside. But seconds later, as she followed them to the door, he slammed it shut. From the other side, she heard the boys cry out. And then, the smell of gasoline. Moments later, the house exploded into flames. When the explosion ripped through the quiet neighborhood of Graham, Washington, the ground shook like thunder. Flames tore through the house in seconds, sending black smoke curling into the winter sky. Neighbors ran out into the street screaming, watching as the Powell home became an inferno. Within minutes, the house was gone. Nothing but burning wood, shattered glass, and the echo of sirens. Firefighters arrived quickly, but it was too late. Inside, they found the remains of Josh Powell and his two sons, Charlie, aged 7, and Braden, aged 5. Both boys had been struck with a hatchet before the fire. They never stood a chance. For the social worker who'd brought them there, the scene was a nightmare. She had called 911 the moment the door slammed, shouting into the phone that, "He won't let me in." But by the time help arrived, the house had already been engulfed. The community was stunned. How could a father do this? Investigators quickly confirmed what everyone already feared. The explosion wasn't an accident. It was intentional. Josh had poured 10 gallons of gasoline throughout the house, barricaded the doors, and set it ablaze. In his final act, he took the lives of his children, the only pieces of Susan that remained, before taking his own. Police later found emails Josh had sent minutes before the fire. One read simply, "I'm sorry. Goodbye." Another message, sent to his attorney, said, "I'm not able to live without my sons." For Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, the news was unbearable. First their daughter, now their grandsons. In one cruel moment, their entire family was gone. The tragedy dominated national headlines. People struggled to understand how a man under constant supervision could still find a way to commit such horror. In the weeks that followed, investigators pieced together the moments leading up to the fire. Josh had withdrawn money from his bank account, donated his children's toys, and emptied his home of nearly everything. All clear signs of premeditation. Inside the ashes of the house, detectives recovered a few haunting items: children's drawings, melted toys, and fragments of a book Susan once read to them at bedtime. It was more than just a murder-suicide. It was the final chapter in a story of control, anger, and obsession that began years earlier. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details surfaced about the Powell family's history. Susan Powell, Josh's father, was still in prison at the time of the explosion. When he learned what had happened, he showed no visible remorse. In letters, he called his son a victim of society. To many, it became clear that toxicity ran deep through the Powell bloodline. Control, secrecy, and manipulation were learned behaviors passed down, like a legacy of darkness. After the explosion, authorities reopened the search for Susan Powell's remains. They were determined to find answers, not just for closure but for justice. Searchers combed through abandoned mines, frozen lakes, and stretches of desert in Utah and Nevada. Helicopters flew over desolate terrain. Cadaver dogs were deployed again and again. But despite years of searching, not a single trace of Susan was ever found. Even without a body, the evidence was overwhelming. Police were convinced that Josh Powell had murdered his wife in December 2009 and had hidden her remains somewhere remote, perhaps in one of the deep mine shafts of the Utah desert. Every discovery pointed toward a man driven by control. He couldn't bear to lose Susan, and when he realized he'd lost her family, his freedom, and his sons, he destroyed everything that remained. The official investigation into Susan's disappearance remains open, but the people closest to her know the truth. She didn't run away. She didn't vanish on her own. She was silenced, and the echoes of that silence, her laughter, her fear, her hope, still haunt those who remember her story. In the weeks following the explosion, the entire nation mourned. News outlets called it a tragedy that could have been prevented. People demanded to know how a man under investigation for murder and under supervision during visits could carry out such horror. The Cox family, broken yet determined, turned their grief into a fight for justice. They filed multiple lawsuits against the Washington Department of Social and Health Services, against child protective workers, and even against the state itself. Their argument was clear. The system had failed. It had ignored the warning signs, allowed unsupervised contact, and underestimated Josh's volatility. In 2020, after years of hearings, the courts finally acknowledged that state workers made critical errors in handling the Powell case. The Cox family won a settlement of $98 million, not for the money, but for acknowledgement that lives could have been saved. Meanwhile, Susan Powell, Josh's father, served time for voyeurism and child pornography. After his release in 2017, he lived quietly in Washington, never speaking publicly about Susan or the tragedy. He died in 2018, taking his secrets with him. Even with both Powells gone, Susan's case remained open. Her parents never gave up hope that her remains would one day be found. They held annual vigils, urging anyone with information to come forward. As years passed, new leads surfaced, bones found in Utah deserts, reports of buried remains near abandoned mines. But every test ended in heartbreak. None belonged to Susan. The investigation, though cold, never fully closed. To this day, police maintain that Josh Powell remains the primary suspect in her disappearance. But with his death, the truth may have died too. Even after more than a decade, the story of Susan Powell refuses to fade. Her disappearance has become one of the most haunting mysteries in American true crime, a symbol of how control, fear, and silence can destroy lives. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials continue to revisit the case. Each retelling brings new theories. Some say Susan was buried deep within Utah's mining lands. Others believe her body lies beneath a remote stretch of desert, once mapped by Josh himself. In 2019, police once again searched the West Desert of Utah, acting on a new tip. They combed through ground once frozen in time, hoping to bring closure. But like every search before it, nothing was found. For Susan's parents, every discovery is a mix of hope and heartbreak. Each lead reminds them that somewhere, their daughter's story still waits to be finished. Beyond the case, Susan's tragedy sparked national reform. Lawmakers used her story to push for better protections for victims of domestic abuse and improved child custody evaluations in high-risk families. Her name became a rallying cry, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place for a woman is the home she's trying to save. And even though her body has never been found, Susan's voice, through her journals, her videos, and her courage, continues to speak louder than ever. It's been years since Susan Powell vanished, yet her story still echoes through the quiet suburbs of Utah and the memories of those who loved her. Her smiling face on missing posters has become more than a reminder of loss. It's a symbol of strength, of a woman who tried to protect her children, who left behind a trail of courage in the middle of fear. Every year on December 6th, candles are lit in her name. The lights flicker softly. One for Susan, one for Charlie, one for Braden. Their glow cuts through the darkness, reminding everyone that even after tragedy, love remains. The home where she once lived has long been torn down. The ashes of Josh's house have been cleared away, but the emotional ruins, the questions, the what-ifs, the pain, still linger. Who knows where Susan is now? Maybe buried deep beneath the sand she once drove across. Maybe somewhere quiet, where no one can find her, but where her spirit still waits to be heard. The Powell case may never have a true ending, but for those who followed it, for her parents, her friends, and millions who learned her name, it serves as a warning and a whisper, a warning about the monsters that can hide behind familiar smiles, and a whisper from a woman who refused to be forgotten, because even in her absence, Susan Powell left behind something indestructible, a story that demands we never stop asking questions and never stop listening to the silence she left behind.